All right, we're back at Beyond the Woo. And today we're going to dive into the default mode network, which is basically kind of like our inner narrator.
Inner narrator, inner saboteur, all the parts, like all those things that we're worried about, they're coming from the DMN.
So kind of like it could be our villain.
Oh, yeah.
Or it could be the vastness to healing.
With my clients, I talk about it as the voice of the critic, which is also the critical function. We need that part of our brain. So the DMN has lots and lots of roles. So I can't wait to dive in and talk about it.
Yeah. So basically, I think of it as a program that's running, and it's just in there and it's running, and it's maybe been the same program for years, decades, and it, maybe keeps us safe, and maybe at times it can be a little suffocating.
Oh, for sure. I mean, when you think about it from the negative perspective, right? The DMN, so the default mode network, is this configuration of different parts of our brain that are all activated mostly when we don't have a task. So it was discovered in, I think, 2001. Yeah. So the scientist at the University of Washington noticed that when people were put in an MRI machine to do a particular brain study, when they weren't given the task of the study, the brain was doing something else. It wasn't just quiet. And so his name was Rackley, and he and his colleagues at University of Washington said, well, maybe we should study that. And they asked people, okay, we're going to give you a task. Like, think of a color, right? Okay, now stop. Now don't. Now stare at the little crosshatch on the screen. And everybody's brains did the same kind of thing. And it was the posterior cingulate cortex and the MPFC, all these parts of the brain. The two lateral lobes that are part of the temporal lobes. So all of that was lighting up when they didn't have anything to do. And and so they're like, what the heck is this? And we've only known about it for 24 years. So the default mode network is actually a critical part of the brain. And now we know it's implicated in all kinds of mental health challenges. So.
Well, what I love that you were saying there is, like, in 2001, they discovered this. This is like venturing into space, but it's the space of our mind.
Exactly.
And this is what's so exciting about living at this point in time is we're doing this amazing work in what is the brain actually doing? How is it actually functioning? Is there a way to reboot it?
Yeah.
Reset it, expand it, and rewire it.
100%. And the answer is yes, right? Like, we know that because of the work of Rackley and his colleagues, that's led to other research with people like Robin Carhart-Harris, who I know I talk about all the time, but his team has found that he's the one who came up with this thing called the entropic brain theory, which says that when you take psychedelics, the DMN actually goes offline completely. There's no activity in the DMN. And as a result, the brain, all the hierarchies in the brain that normally are being orchestrated by the ego, and, hey, focus on this. Hey, focus on that. Hey, worry about this. Hey, let me give you some dopamine for your worries, pattern that you engage in most days. That is all gone. And suddenly, the rest of the brain, even the pieces of the default mode network, they're all talking at the same time.
Wow.
So you have more access to your brain because there's no hierarchy happening. And the part that wants you to ruminate is quiet.
Right. Well, so when you ruminate, that's when the DMN is overactive.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
And this is where it can become the villain to us, is when it actually gets overactive. And that's where we can see depression, anxiety, OCD, the way we ruminate about past traumas really just kind of keep us stuck.
Well, and the other thing that happens is a lot of those parts of the brain that are included in the DMN, they get reward. They're on the dopamine reward system. So the more you ruminate, the more dopamine you get. And so you're getting dopamine for ruminating. And then if you try to solve the problem, you do get dopamine for problem solving. But then if you're not ruminating some more, you don't get any more dopamine. So it winds up being this vicious cycle of, oh, if I think about something else that's rumination, then I'll get some more dopamine.
Right. And this is where I find my clients get so stuck.
Yeah.
They get stuck in these negative self narratives. And you're sitting there week over week working with someone and you're like, wait a minute, I thought we just explored how this wasn't fitting for you. But yet a week later, we're kind of still here.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening? And that's a very good explanation of what's happening is, well, if I'm getting a little dopamine hit from staying in this negative self narrative loop and I'm just reinforcing it and I'm fixating on it, maybe there's some value, distorted value in belief in staying in that mindset and actually moving towards health and healing.
You're right, because what's happening on the brain level, right? Like just think about it from the perspective of what feeds you. So if the brain's getting some dopamine, which makes it feel good, and there's no other kind of influx of feel-good neurotransmitters coming in, then what does it matter? Like whatever it is that's going to get me the hit, I'm going to keep doing.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's worry. It doesn't matter if it's something more pernicious like suicidal ideation. If you're getting dopamine from it, your brain is going to keep doing it.
Yeah. This reminds me of, there was a movie, I think it was in the 80s, Robert Redford, Michelle Pfeiffer. It was called Up Close and Personal. It was about them being reporters. And Robert Redford's character looks at Michelle Pfeiffer and he's like, if it bleeds, it leads, And so often I think we get stuck in the narrative drama. If it bleeds, it leads. That's where I'm going to stay, because that bleeding is like, there's a false sense of like,
but you're onto it, because it's like then we mistakenly believe that it's valuable. That if I have feelings, then this has value, and it's like, oh no. Right. Like, be careful. What feelings do you want to have? Are you choosing these feelings? Because if you're not choosing the feelings, maybe they're not valuable. Maybe they're fake. Maybe it's your DMN lying to you. Like the joke with therapists is if anybody's never had therapy, like therapists say all the time, don't believe everything you think. Because sometimes it's a flat out lie that your brain is telling you to get more dopamine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like with anxiety, you have this hypervigilance, which again, sometimes people falsely associate with, well, I'm going to get something done, or I'm going to avoid catastrophe because I'm hypervigilant in all cases. And even though it's exhausting and I don't like it, but there's this false sense again of, well, maybe this is going to protect me.
Right. And it's usually not. Like, more than, I don't know, what's the number? Something like half or 60% of what we are afraid of never happens.
Yeah.
Right? Like we have this built up fear, and we believe that hypervigilance is going to protect us from something. And in reality, the thing that we're afraid of never happens at all. And it sometimes doesn't even come close to happening, right? Like worried about like, well, what if I'm driving down the freeway and I get in an accident? Like, okay. How many accidents have you been in? Really? Genuinely? Like one your whole life? Maybe you're not going to get in an accident. Maybe the probability isn't there. Possibility, not probability.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know you love to geek out.
I do love to geek out on the science.
So maybe we could go a little bit into what actually is happening. Like, what did they see on a functional MRI scan? I know you talked about it a little bit more, but just with like, what's the activity happening? What are we seeing with the limbic system with that DNM activity?
So when they did the first experiments, and we've seen it even more, like they've gotten a lot more granular with fMRI since 2001. But the very first images, so they had somebody look at the cross hatches. And if you've ever had an MRI, there's usually a screen that you can look at, and they just want you to focus on this little X or cross that's in the middle. And what they saw, because an fMRI looks at the blood flow in the brain, the blood concentration in the brain. And what they found was when someone was not given a task, the parts of the brain that lit up were parts of the limbic system, so parts of the temporal lobes, so both parts of the temporal lobe, so the lateral and the medial temporal lobes, the PFC, so the prefrontal cortex, so that part right at the kind of middle part, right? If you're looking at your brain, it's not all the way to your forehead, it's kind of in the middle. And then this part of the brain that we know the least about is called the posterior cingulate cortex, PCC. That part of the brain has the richest flow of blood to the brain that we see on any scans. Which means that it's really important in how we manage. And we know from research that the PCC is responsible for self-identification, self-reflection, self-conception. So if you're having a memory where you're thinking about, hey, remember that time when I went snowboarding in Idaho with my cousin and I wore a purple jumpsuit and I skinned my knee, and like all the self-reference is happening in the PCC. And a lot of the memory is happening in the PFC, prefrontal cortex. So and in the temporal lobes, it's emotion. And it's also other types of memory like olfactory memory, so smell, motor cortex memory, so movement, the other kinds of experiential memory are happening in those lateral parts of the brain. And so when you have that determination, that complex of systems, right? Everything's about you. So it's my feelings, it's what I smelled, it's what I heard, it's what I felt, it's what I was wearing, it's what me. That part of the brain is the ego, basically. It's enough about me. What do you think about me, right? Like it's that experience. And so that part of your brain in a day-to-day experience, if you're not looking for a task, or if you're driving and you're kind of dissociating on the road, right? That part of your brain can kick in and be like, oh, let's do some worrying. Let's think about you. Let's think about all the things. And if you're already somebody who's prone to anxiety, prone to depression, prone to OCD, then all of the negative is what's going to show up. Worry about this. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about this possibility? Have you thought about that possibility? And what's happening is that critical aspect of your brain, it's trying to help you. It's not trying to hurt you, but it's doing it in such a way because it's such a short circuit, literally. So if you look at the parts of the brain that we're talking about, they're all really close to each other. And they just do this, loop, loop, because there's not a big distance it has to go. It can just be like, oh, and Jenny, remember the time this happened, and you remember 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 how you felt about that, and you remember, and it's just like constant. Because it doesn't have to go deep into the frontal cortex to retrieve memory, and it doesn't have to go deep into other parts of the brain to retrieve feeling or experience. So it's really efficient, and it has to be because it's the same part of your brain that's going to protect you. Like if you're driving the car and somebody jumps in front of your car and you hit the brakes before you even realize you hit the brakes, that's part of that system.
So we want that to keep working.
We want it to work. We want it to do its job. We don't want to empower it to do other things besides its job. And that's the part that's challenging for most people. Right?
So how is a psychedelic actually affecting the DMN? Too many letters
that sound alike, right?
They sound alike.
Yeah. So according to the research that is being done at UC San Francisco by Robin Carhart-Harris and his team, it's the DMN is deactivated in the presence of psychedelics. We don't know why, but it goes offline. And the way the research is presented, what's happening is it's not just that the DMN itself is targeted, it's that the whole system goes through what he calls an entropic process. So for all of us who had to take physics right in high school or college, entropy is movement towards disorganization. It is not the state of disorganization. It is the movement towards disorganization or baseline. And the idea is that before the development evolutionarily of the DMN, that we had a consciousness that was more kind of like animals or babies. So there's no ego. If you've had more than one child, or you've been around more than one child at a time, you know that if you have a 2-year-old crying on a plane, soon all the 2-year-olds are crying on the plane. Anybody under the age of 2, when they hear the other babies crying, will start crying too. And that's because there's no identity outside of that baby and other babies, or baby and mom. So there's no I yet. And that's a function of there not being a fully formed DMN. And it's the DMN that gives you the I in that experience. So that early consciousness that's similar to a baby or similar to an animal, that's what's happening when the DMN goes offline. You are more in line with that form of original consciousness before the development of that egocentric, and I don't mean that in a negative way, just the ability, the capacity for ego.
So I'm going to take it out a little bit of geek land.
Please. Because I could go on and everybody be like changing the channel. Like, what the heck is she talking about? Yeah.
Yeah. So Robin Carhart-Harris, he talks about it being the snow on the hill experience, that we're on a sled and we're going down life. We're going down this hill, and there's carved pathways, and we're just going, we're going. And when we take that DMN offline, it's like we've got fresh snow, and now we're more flexible.
Right.
We can go a different pathway. Right. We don't have to keep traveling down that hill in the same way, that we actually see new possibilities, new pathways emerge.
Right. And there are no more ruts, right? Like all the ruts are covered over. You have a more smooth transition, if you will, or capacity. And it's interesting because some of the later research by him and his team is that when you take the DMN offline with a psychedelic and then you reboot it, and that's the snow analogy. It winds up being like, oh, it's not just that I took it offline and then when I plug it in, it's going to be just like it was. It's that it went offline and I'm starting more fresh, not completely from scratch like a baby, but I actually have this layer of fresh snow that helps cover everything and make things a little smoother because there's more opportunity and there's more connection and more options.
Yeah. And I think with my clients, I a lot of times talk about this. It's kind of like a CPR for the brain. It's reawakening.
Yeah.
And it's, bringing you back to life, maybe in a new way, and regenerating maybe some dormant, connections.
Well, 100%. And the thing that's so interesting about that is that psychedelics also facilitate neurogenesis. So not only do you have new connections, you have new structures to continue to support those connections. And all psychedelics actually have been found to create some sort of neurogenesis. So synapses, axons, dendrites, they all turn up different. It's dependent on the person and dependent on the type of psychedelic, but they see it in animal models, so we know it's happening in humans too.
Yeah. So it's not exactly like the movie Limitless, where you take that special pill, but at the same time, there is some potentiality, I think, that's really unique and different. I certainly experienced that in my journeys, like the creativity, the new way of looking at things, the new way of problem solving, the new way of sense of self. And, for me, again, that was like this piece of like, I was always on that like pathway of, I got to be better, I got to be successful, I got to and just to actually be still for a moment and just enjoy the place that I've arrived, that I don't always have to be like working harder and harder and harder. Just enjoy where I am.
Yeah. Yeah. And that makes it possible though, too, right? Like, because if you don't feel that rest in that moment, if you don't get your brain to not be in the groove, right? Like it's like a machine or an engine, right? Like you're just stuck. If you're not doing that, if you just have that going 24/7, then you never actually get the relief in order to sit back and go, oh, this is who I am. Oh, look at my other options. I'm just thinking about a particular client of mine that I've been trying to get to do a psychedelic journey with. She hasn't done it yet, but she has really just malicious OCD. Malicious. That internal critic is mean to her. And it's like, I just want you to have a little relief. I just take her offline for a moment and, 2 hours. When she comes back, her fangs might not be as sharp.
Yeah, it's such a good example of like the devil so often people want to hold on to, even though it's a devil, and I don't want to live with these thoughts anymore,
Right.
but it's what I've gotten accustomed to and what's normal in a sense to me, even though there's a part of me that's pushing it away. And so I think sometimes this is where that preparation again becomes so important before we go to a journey, because if someone isn't ready to confront that, maybe that might be disintegrated a little bit, that I'm going to have to find a new sense of being, and the devil is actually gone, maybe. What will that look like?
Well, but to your point, right? Like then what you're talking about is also the persona being gone. If the persona is gone and the devil doesn't have that kind of internal devil of the rumination and the voice, the critic, if they're not there to just persecute that person all the time, do they even know who they are without the persecution? And sometimes people freak out because they're so used to the persecution defining their sense of self that without it, they don't know how to stand in that place. They don't know how to, it's like, being accepted all of a sudden. Like, what do you do when you don't have to fight anymore? Do you know yourself if you're not battling all the time?
Yeah, interesting place to walk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, had this conversation with a client just 2 days ago, right? Like, do you know yourself if you aren't putting on your armor every day and getting on your horse and going to fight the good fight for your family? And I think, and he broke. He had his first ketamine treatment, and he was just like, I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Now, of course, we don't want people to flip to the other side and go to opposite toxic positivity and like it's all roses and daisies and unicorns and all that. But if we can have some softening of that and really kind of move into this new place.
I think I mean, that's such an important point, right? Like we don't want spiritual bypass. We don't want the dissociation. That's not the point. But noticing that it's not the same thing to seek relief from the dissociation or with the dissociation, seek relief from the DMN being such a meanie sometimes. The relief from that is not the same as healing. It's not the same as integration. And it's a hard thing for people to know, to understand if they've never had any relief and suddenly they have relief in that, hour or 2 or 6, depending on what kind of psychedelic you're doing. Like, that's actually the beginning. That's not the end. That's not the goal, right?
Yeah. Well, and different psychedelics can work a little bit different on the DMN. We've got psilocybin, ayahuasca, LSD, and DMT works one way, and ketamine might work a different way. What do you know about those medicines as how they interact with the DMN?
So the DMN goes offline with the traditional serotonergic psychedelics. So that's LSD, ayahuasca for the most part because of the DMT, psilocybin, and mescaline. The others, so a drug like ketamine, the DMN is not completely offline, but it is mostly offline. So you get some dissolution, if you will, of like the temporal lobes go a little offline, the PFC a little offline, and the PCC almost completely offline. So you get less self-referential, but it's not the same as the traditional psychedelics or the classic psychedelics, if you will. But you do get some lessening, get more softening of the DMN with ketamine than without it. So,
yeah. Well, and glutamate seems to be a powerful part of that process.
Yeah. So because with the traditional psychedelics, you have cascades of like serotonin and other kinds of neurotransmitters, but the glutamate is the one that's released with ketamine. You get a flood of ketamine. Ketamine creates a flood of glutamate in the brain. And then that's actually super happy for most brains. Brains like glutamate. It's the most prolific neurotransmitter in the brain. So brains feel happy with it. But you still, people are often still able, depending on the dose, still able to guide themselves in their psychedelic journey with ketamine. So,
yeah. Well, and Robin Carhart-Harris has done a lot of work in this area. Besides the entropic brain theory, he looks at the rebus model, the pivotal mental states, which, that pivotal mental states really is looking at that mental plasticity that we start to encounter and identity of self, and so it's a fascinating intersection of these medicines with actually what's going on in our brain.
Yeah, he would be probably the first person to say that ketamine's not a real psychedelic, which I disagree with him on. But talking about like all of the different options, all the different ways of looking at what's happening in the brain, right? Like all of these different options as ways of thinking about the different. What am I trying to say? Like there's something about being able to allow your brain to do a different thing that we don't typically like as a culture, right? Like we don't like to think of ourselves as having that much neuroplasticity, and yet we want the creativity that comes from it. And that, if you want creativity, then what you're looking for is neuroplasticity, which is the capacity for a diversity of thought. And by expanding the neuroplasticity, you expand the options. So seems like a good plan, but people get scared of it. People are anxious about too much neuroplasticity, I think. I don't know. What's your experience?
I think sometimes people are not ready to do the work.
Yeah.
And so that's where it becomes scary. It's like, oh, I thought I was going to do this, experience. And I was going to change my mind, or expand my consciousness. And it's going to be lovely and wonderful and so enlightening. And yes, and there's still work to be done.
I think, and I think you're touching on something maybe that's a little different than where I was, what my question is, which is, do you find that your clients are afraid of losing their identity because they might have more options, because they might have more available to them, and that's actually frightening? Have you seen that? Or
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think in that, yes, there is this piece of like, oh, this has now been revealed to me. I have these possibilities that maybe I didn't see before. And I don't know, can I unsee those?
Exactly. Yeah.
Can I unsee those? Because if I can't unsee those, then what?
And yes. And I'm thinking about a particular client that, has some OCD type tendencies, and just thinking about like, how do we think of ourselves with those tendencies? And this particular person I'm thinking of, they think that's their superpower. They worry about everything. They don't miss anything. They are hypervigilant, and it makes them really good at their job. And how would you approach somebody who says they want to do psychedelics and expand, but who gets really, really rigid in sticking with that default mode network capacity? Like, what would you say to them?
Yeah. Are you ready to be in a new land of being, to find a new pathway that maybe what you thought was so important that you were spending your time on, what you were so hyper vigilant on? And yes, it maybe makes you good at your job, but at what cost? What stresses is it causing you? What's the internal damage that you're doing to yourself, doing to your mind, and doing to the connections with others? Because when we're hypervigilant, in that hypervigilant state, and we're so focused on production and achievement, I think we miss the sweet moments in life. We miss, moments of peace and calm, and just being without a task, and that doesn't define our value.
Yeah, I think you're on it there. That's I think the hardest thing, especially in LA, but I think just as Americans in general, or Westerners in general, we tend to think our value is in our productivity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's hard for people to let go of that,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
I mean, I think people dream about the day that I could go retire on a desert island. But so often, like when people go retire on the desert island, they almost go a little bit stir crazy because they're like, what do you mean I have nothing to achieve or nothing to do? And I put all my value into this,
Right.
And maybe this is why we see people retire later in life, because they've overvalued productivity as defining sense of self rather than building connections with people and building connections with self. A lot of times I say to my clients, doing nothing is doing something.
Yeah.
And they'll argue with me, but no. And I'm like, honestly, doing nothing is something.
I love that. And meaning becomes its own thing at that point, right? Like, where does the meaning come from? Because if you're not listening to the rumination all the time and taking direction from it, right? Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? We do it this way, do it that way. If you give yourself the option of like, okay, I'm going to do the psychedelic journey and see if there's another road, right? To go back to the snow, right? Like, I'm going to go back to the snow and see if a road emerges or what it feels like just to go down the freshly fallen snow. Like, maybe I really like the feeling of not being in the same, like seeing the same landscape, even though it's the same mountain. Maybe it feels good to see it differently. And I think people need us or need someone to help remind them that that's not only possible, but maybe it's safe. Maybe it's safer than the rocky, jutted, going down the mountain on the snowboard with all the rocks and the ruts and the previously traversed paths.
Yeah. I mean, I think that really sums up and really brings us to this place of where we kind of started this episode that, that disrupting the DMN can actually lead to a new path, can actually lead to healing, can actually lead to self-discovery, can awaken oneself into a new place, a new being.
I think we should end it there because that's actually really, really beautiful to think about.
Yeah. So, well, if you've liked this episode, a little bit of geek, a little bit of just showing up and being here along for the conversation, be sure to like us and check us out on our next episode. We look forward to going again with you beyond the woo.
If you like our show, I want to encourage you to pick up a copy of my book, Mushroom Pharmacy, as everything you're going to need to go beyond the woo. All the science, all the preparation, everything you could possibly want. It's right here in the book, Mushroom Pharmacy. Go get a copy.
So are you ready to go beyond the woo? Are you curious about your own psychedelic journey? Come join me in Mexico. Check out my next retreats at psychedelicplantmedicineretreat.com.